And now to open this webinar, here is our African scholar, Nadira Omarjee.
Thank you, Kamala. Welcome everyone to today's discussion on transitional justice with Howard Varney. I am Nadira Omarjee, all protocols observed. I am a senior researcher at the Nordic Africa Institute on the Africa program. And we're looking forward to a very lively discussion on transitional justice, which is an ongoing process globally, especially now during the time of the pandemic. I'm going to, before I hand over to our executive director, Dr. Therese Shimanda Magnusson, I wanted to read something written by Hannah Arendt when she was observing the Jerusalem trials for the New York Times. She wrote "The Banality of Evil." She said, "You're quite right. I changed my mind and do no longer speak of radical evil. It is indeed my opinion now that evil is never radical, that it is only extreme, and that it possesses neither depth nor any demonic dimension. It can overgrow and lay waste the whole world precisely because it spreads like a fungus on the surface. It is thought-defying, as I said, because thought tries to reach some depth to go to the root, and the moment it concerns itself with evil, it is frustrated because there's nothing. That is its banality. Only the good has depth that can be radical." So with that, and knowing that Jerusalem is a contested terrain, we understand that even the Palestinians are still not afforded their right to justice. And we also understand that there are many people that are confined in conflict-affected areas and are also dealing with this global pandemic. So we think about them today as well, whilst we discuss transitional justice. I hand over now to Therese.
Thank you so much, Nadira, and thank you for those introductory words that really hit me as well, since I've worked in Palestine and Jerusalem and in the Middle East for many years. A warm welcome to everyone attending this seminar today, all protocols observed. It is truly a very timely and important conversation on transitional justice that we are organizing together with Howard Varney this afternoon. For those of you who are new to the Nordic Africa Institute, we were founded in 1962 and currently financed by the Nordic governments. And we produce and support, engage in knowledge development about the developments in Africa. The objective of our work is also to very directly inform policies supportive of improved livelihoods on the continent. The corona pandemic has really put a lot of principles and values, structures, and the belief in social trust to a test. Across the world, we unfortunately today see both actors and governments who take advantage of the situation and either directly or indirectly restrict people's rights, limit transparency, and disregard obligations as duty bearers. In one sense, we're probably at a crossroad very soon, depending on for how long this pandemic will continue. This pandemic will mostly, again, impact the most vulnerable people, those who are mostly at risk. More will be needing access to health facilities. Millions of people we need to share the resources, the limited resources with the shrinking economies that we see. And we also risk of losing the transparency in government decision-making, all of which really necessitates a conversation more in depth, but not only the conversation, but to react and act along with the discussions we're having this afternoon. The democratic principles and the values, the globally agreed values of human rights are needed, perhaps more than ever before. And that is why I'm particularly proud of having you, Howard Varney, with us this afternoon. You work for the International Center for Transitional Justice, and as an advisor with your long experience, you can really shed light on both the challenges that we are foreseeing, but also hopefully the opportunities. So with that, I'd like to immediately hand over to Nadira, my colleague, who will guide us through the afternoon, the program, but also really engage in the discussions that will follow after the presentation. And again, most welcome and thank you for engaging in this conversation. So over to you, Nadira.
Thank you, Therese. My apologies from the South African ambassador, Her Excellency Ms. Bridget Mabandla. She's unable to join us today. She was asked to talk about the constitutional process in South Africa, and she's actually in a briefing with the minister. So she won't be here today, but that will mean that we have more time for questions and answers. It is absolute pleasure for us at the Nordic Africa Institute to welcome Howard Varney. About a month and a half ago, I was listening in on a webinar hosted by the London School of Economics on transitional justice. And the moderator introduced Howard as the Beyonce of transitional justice because he's just known as Howard. Howard, as Therese said, is a senior program advisor at the International Center for Transitional Justice that's based in Tunis. But he has quite a history in transitional justice. He started off as a student at the University of KwaZulu-Natal at Howard College, part of the End the Conscription campaign, and he has pursued a legal career around human rights since then. He consulted for the South African Truth and Reconciliation Commission and was the UN Chief Investigator for Sierra Leone, TRC, as well as assisted in the TRC in East Timor. These are some of the highlights of his career. He also is part of the Johannesburg Bar, and his legal practice in South Africa focuses on truth-seeking, prosecutions around institutional reforms and reparations, and public interest litigation as well. He also sits at the London Bar, part of the Guernica 37, which is a group of prominent transitional justice advocates. So with that, we welcome Howard to talk to us today about transitional justice, and we hope to have as much time as possible to have as the viewers or participants today, to also ask your questions to Howard.
Thanks, Nadira, for that introduction, and also thanks for embarrassing me a little bit. Just one small correction. The International Center for Transitional Justice has its headquarters in New York City, but it is true that there is a branch office in Tunis, which is a very active branch of the organization, but there are also branch offices in about 12 other countries. So I've been given about 30 minutes to speak about this topic. But before I do, thanks again to the Nordic Africa Institute for inviting me, and thanks to you, Nadira, because you've been the driving force. Your persistence, your nagging has really made this day happen. So thanks to you and the Institute. 30 minutes goes by pretty quickly now. In fact, I'll try to take less than 30 minutes, although I'm not known for my brevity, unfortunately. I'm going to try to explore three issues, and both Teresa and Nadira have alluded to these, is to see how the pandemic has impacted on transitional justice and the human rights agenda more broadly. And really, I think, this poses a challenge in Africa, but also elsewhere, as to how to keep these priorities on the agenda. Then I want to look at how practitioners on the continent, but also globally, need to carefully assess how the potential for the crisis to open the door to further conflict is ever present, and what could be done. And as Teresa has mentioned, some of the measures we've seen to combat the pandemic go somewhat beyond what is strictly required. We've seen centralization of political power. We've seen some undue infringement of fundamental rights. We've seen quite a lot of excessive security force action. We've seen how democratic oversight has been excluded. And we've seen how the opportunity has been used to marginalize political opponents, as well as civil society more generally. And sadly, we may see some political leaders, loving these extra powers and being a little reluctant to relinquish them, especially when the crisis starts to subside. And so all of these things really can lay the seeds for future conflict and violence. And for most of the afternoon, I want to focus on these issues. I did raise a third matter with Nadira and her colleagues, and that is, I've noticed how the crisis had brought to the fore the fact that in the past, transitional justice practitioners really have paid little or no attention to how access to healthcare, or the lack thereof, has contributed to laying the seeds of conflict. So, for example, if we look at the way that various transitional justice mechanisms like truth commissions, very few have addressed healthcare as an issue, as a potential underlying cause of conflict. And in my estimation, probably less than 3 or 4 have dealt with it in any comprehensive manner. But I haven't really researched that topic, so my apologies. I won't be dealing with that matter further. Let's now turn to the conflict we found ourselves in. All of us have been impacted in our day-to-day activities. Travel has stopped. Conferences, meetings, workshops have pretty much come to a halt. They've all been moved online. For the lawyers, we've seen how disruptive that has been. Many court cases have been postponed indefinitely. Some have gone online, but those involving trials and inquests where you need witnesses and cross-examination, those have been postponed, many into 2021. Commissions of inquiry have also been suspended. The Truth Commission in the Gambia, which had been running for the last 18 months or so, they're on hold. We've seen how the investigations of the International Criminal Court have come to a halt. And yes, policymakers and those controlling the purse strings, they're realigning priorities, and issues that have featured large on our agendas, such as addressing the aftermath of war, conflict, repression. In recent times, they've all taken something of a backseat. Now, the new focus, of course, is justified. We certainly do need this focus. But at the same time, we mustn't lose sight of the fact that while we are prioritizing the fight against COVID-19, the plight of victims of human rights abuses, those in war-torn societies, refugees, internally displaced, their situations are going to get a whole lot worse. And they really will be on the receiving end of the corona pandemic. And when you think about that, the virus has yet to peak, and you think about the context in which these people live, with broken healthcare systems and broken infrastructure, we're looking at a very, very serious situation. And since the pandemic is likely to really deepen the fault lines, political, economic, and social, I think the potential for social turbulence, violence, and conflict must be pretty high. And if I can just pause for a moment and consider South Sudan, a country where I've done a little bit of work, and I was actually chatting to a colleague last week, and he mentioned a few frightening things. He drew to my attention that following the outbreak, some of the leadership went down with illness, possibly COVID-19, and that then left something of a leadership vacuum. It meant that key decisions couldn't be taken. Key laws and regulations that needed to be passed were put on ice. The peace process grounded to a halt. Key appointments in those peace structures couldn't be made. The bodies monitoring the peace, they couldn't meet. They couldn't react to various tensions and incidents. He also mentioned that the health ministry became pretty dysfunctional through nepotism and mismanagement, and that paralyzed South Sudan's response to COVID-19. He pointed out that there's only one entity in the whole country that can carry out tests, and that's not the government. The pandemic is also giving rise to massive corruption and economic crime as aid money and loans from international bodies are being misused. He pointed out that most South Sudanese, they're not in a position to isolate. They simply have to get out into the streets and eke out a living. He mentioned that there's terrible stigma on the rise. Those who have COVID-19 are on the receiving end of discrimination and abuse. The education system has completely collapsed because only the economic elite have access to information technology. So we can see how the pandemic is really deepening the inequalities, and the potential for conflict is really growing exponentially. And more generally, if one looks at developments around the world, we can see how the pandemic has really exacerbated pre-existing trends of populism, nationalism, and this in turn has fueled racism, xenophobia, and of course conflict. So let's now turn to the global response to COVID-19. We've seen really extensive measures being taken across the globe, and by and large, a lot of people have supported these measures, but there really is rising concern that around their scope, their legality, necessity, and proportionality, not to mention the impact on human rights and livelihoods. So we have seen something of a possible decline in constitutional democracy. There has been an interesting study that was completed last month by the International Security Sector Advisory Team, ISAT, and they're a division of Geneva-based DCAF. And they looked at various measures and the impact of these measures on a number of societies. And they carried out a qualitative and a quantitative analysis of some 66 countries. And to cut to the chase, they came up with some findings, and I'll take you through some of them. At a very high level, they concluded that the scope for excesses tended to be limited where constitutions imposed checks and balances on the executive, where parliamentary oversight was meaningful, and when the measures were subject to judicial scrutiny and review. Now, there are some important lessons to be learned from the past few weeks and months. In other words, how we've dealt with the first wave of infections. And I think it is time for some reflection and to look at some lessons, because some experts have pointed out we're probably going to be seeing another wave of infections, a so-called second wave, later this year, and perhaps more waves in the coming years. And so we might need to adapt our responses to these new waves. Some of you may have taken a look at the COVID-19 Civic Freedom Tracker, and they've come up with some interesting statistics, some interesting data. And here's a sampling. 111 countries introduced measures impacting the freedom of assembly, 33 limited freedom of expression, 22 specifically restricted press freedom, 28 limited access to information. There were 27 instances of surveillance. 23 countries restricted the right to privacy. sorry, 28 countries, and those 28 happen to be using the contact tracing apps. 35 introduced COVID-19 related censorship, and 3 countries maintained existing internet shutdowns, notwithstanding the epidemic and the need for internet access. So I think it is true to say that a number of countries have exploited the crisis in order to engage in what I refer to as authoritarian creep. And I'd like to take you through some examples from a number of countries, starting with El Salvador. The El Salvadorian president introduced 2 decrees in which he declared a state of emergency as well as a state of exception. And those powers were used to set up containment centers, which allowed for mandatory quarantine, which saw hundreds of people being rounded up by the police and army. They've been held in these administrative facilities without charge, without access to lawyers or the court. Activists, in fact, rushed to the Constitutional Court, and the court ruled that these detentions were unlawful. The response of the president was to ignore the Constitutional Court ruling and to order the police and army to increase those detentions. And he even said that if physical assault is used during those arrests, those will be tolerated. There will be no consequences. In Ethiopia, we've seen sweeping emergency powers. We've seen the suspension of parliamentary and local elections. Human Rights Watch has pointed to arbitrary arrests, particularly of government critics and journalists. In Bulgaria, the emergency law specifically says physical force can be used, but it doesn't set any limitations. It doesn't set up the criteria or thresholds for the use of force. It authorizes police to instruct telecommunication companies to hand over their data. And there is fear that this data and this information will be used to monitor political opponents. Coming back to Africa, in Ghana, even though there's an Emergency Powers Act and there's a constitution which allows for the declaring of public health emergencies, the state rather enacted something called the Imposition of Restrictions Act. And this meant that unlike the Emergency Powers Act, there was no need to consult with the Council of State. And this is a committee of eminent elders. Unlike the emergency powers under the Constitution, Parliament has little or no role to play. Parliament can't lift the emergency, only the President can. And very worryingly, there's no mention in that law of COVID-19 or even coronavirus. There's no expiry date. So these are all really ominous signs. In my own country, South Africa, we've seen the mobilization of tens of thousands of troops that have hit the streets to support the lockdown. There have been multiple complaints involving brutality and even killings. This resulted in a landmark judgment last month in which the High Court ordered the government to implement a code of conduct as to how security forces must conduct themselves. Remarkably, there was no such thing before that court order. And the judge was scathing in his criticism of the security forces, slamming them for treating poor people with contempt and indifference. In India, we've seen how the crisis has allowed state forces to ramp up actions against the Muslim minority, who've been blamed for the spread of the virus, obviously falsely blamed. And the government has done little to prevent that hate speech. And they've even used the crisis as a pretext to clamp down on protesters who've been clamoring for the repeal of that citizenship law. In Uganda, we've seen how security forces have brought in paramilitary groups. There's a militia known as the Local Defense Unit. And media and local activists have pointed to wide-scale beatings, shootings, canings, and the arrest of lesbian, gay, and bisexual and transgender youth all under the guise of combating the pandemic. In Turkey, the president and others have issued circulars. Many of them haven't even been published in the government gazette. They withheld funding from opposition local government. They've discriminated against political opponents. So journalists and social media activists have been rounded up. And even when a number of prisoners were released, around 90,000 were released, none of those included political prisoners and prisoners of conscience. Hungary is another extreme example. I probably don't have to elaborate, but it really is a brazen example of a country sliding into full-blown authoritarianism. The president is not able to rule with decree on an indefinite basis. There's no real oversight. The courts have been closed down. Also in Argentina, we see emergency rule through decree, which has allowed the security minister to carry out what is called cyber patrols on social networks. And they've taken action against people they believe have issued misinformation about the virus. There are 12 criminal cases on the go, and if convicted, those journalists and others face up to 6 years in jail. In Sri Lanka, we've seen particular abuse. And in fact, there the emergency powers have been issued without any legal basis whatsoever. No state of disaster has been declared. No regulations have been published in the government gazette. No parliamentary approval has been secured. Indeed, Parliament was dissolved in early March. Police and army have rounded up some 66,000 individuals for allegedly breaking the curfew. Only 20,000 in the last month. In terms of internet monitoring and contact tracing, this is run by the intelligence agencies, the very same agencies that have been accused of widespread torture against opposition types and Tamil civilians and ex-combatants, particularly in the north. The Inspector of Police has ordered the police to arrest those who criticize the government when it comes to the coronavirus response. And some 20 individuals have been arrested for apparently spreading false information. In Cambodia, we've seen very alarming developments. We've seen a law that has been enacted which has mobilized the military and monitoring telecommunications. They're banning certain media outlets. And again, there's no expiry date. There's no judicial or administrative oversight to speak of. In Bangladesh, the same is in process. A de facto state of emergency is in place, again, without any official order. It's all done through administrative restrictions. There's no legal or parliamentary oversight. Both Parliament and the Supreme Court were closed. And local activists say that, in effect, you've seen the suspension of fundamental rights in that country. Journalists and cartoonists have been arrested. And government has alarmingly dropped journalists from the list of emergency services who remain exempt from lockdown restrictions. And so there goes the last means of any real oversight. So let me now turn to some conclusions and some recommendations. And as Teresa mentioned, I promised that I would point to some good practices, some potential pathways out of this morass. Let me first say that what is quite depressing is that countries that were already struggling, those that already had rampant inequality, socioeconomic instability, high levels of unemployment, those sadly are the ones that tended to use security force actions and excessive security force intervention to deal with the public health crisis. And you might have guessed from the examples that I've highlighted that countries that already we're struggling with upholding democracy and constitutionalism, those are the ones that seem to be in danger of sliding into an authoritarian state. So let's now look at some lessons, potentially for any second wave of infections. First big lesson is we should be encouraging countries when they combat the crisis to do so on the back of legality. So in other words, decrees and administrative circulars should be something of the past. There should be a legal basis. Law should be invoked, law should be enacted. The constitution should be adhered to. And so, for example, countries like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh, who've issued their interventions without any legal basis, they've seen some of the worst excesses. Secondly, there should be some kind of balancing exercise. There should always be an endeavor to strike something of an appropriate balance between responding to the virus and limiting human rights. And when we engage in this balancing exercise, it should be done in an open, transparent, and participatory way. It should be done on the back of scientific research. And again, we need to be flexible. Hong Kong isn't normally seen as a role model for these kinds of things, but the regulation they issued obliges the local Hong Kong government to review their directions every 14 days. And that's within the context of a regulation that itself expires in 3 months. Thirdly, the kinds of measures that are introduced normally should abide by the principle that measures that respect rights tend to be more effective than those that don't. So, for example, where contact tracing apps are seen to be disproportionately in invading privacy, they're unlikely to have a major uptake. Finland perhaps is something of a role model, and there's an author who has highlighted some best practices. Here are a few of them. So when emergencies or disasters are declared, typically the decrees or the laws should require compliance with international human rights standards and obligations. Each law should insert a sunset clause. In other words, these measures should be short or temporary in nature, and there should be a procedure for their extension. There should be a procedure for systematic review of legislation. So, for example, in Finland, they have a standing committee, which includes constitutional law experts, and their opinions are made public. In terms of parliamentary oversight, New Zealand has a pretty good example. They have a bipartisan parliamentary committee called the Epidemic Response Committee. And this closely oversees and monitors the government's response, and they help to identify and remedy mistakes. Fourthly, and importantly, courts should be permitted to continue operating. And even if normal day-to-day cases are suspended, the courts should be open to deal with urgent matters, particularly when it comes to rights violations. And we've seen in places like Hungary and Bangladesh, when courts are closed, people have no recourse. And compare that to the ruling of the Constitutional Court in Kosovo, which ordered the government to enact legislation when it engaged in measures to combat the virus. The Supreme Court of Israel, when the government went ahead without any parliamentary oversight, they ruled that parliamentary oversight was required when it came to the implementation of these measures. Fifthly, there ought to be some kind of collaboration between citizens and authorities to ease tensions. So in the Tunisian city of Medellin, there's been very close community police interaction, which has helped to ease tensions in that city. During the Ebola crisis in Guinea, civilians and army set up coordination centers, and these were very helpful in building trust and reducing misinformation. Sixthly, and lastly, roles of the security forces need to be clarified and defined pretty closely. After all, they are now assuming roles that they don't normally pursue in normal times. And needless to say, oversight of their day-to-day contact needs to be doubly alert during these extraordinary times. And we've seen the example of South Africa where a court had to step in order to clarify and define their role. Lastly, I should say that all societies really do need strong and courageous civil society, ready to challenge authorities, ready to challenge policies that are anti-democratic and repressive. So, in conclusion, human rights and transitional justice practitioners still have a very, very critical role to play in monitoring excesses, in identifying potential causes of future conflict, and pushing for those kinds of measures that are going to minimize or hopefully prevent that conflict. So, Nadira and colleagues, thank you for your patience. I will stop there and hand over to you so that the discussion can commence.
Thank you, Howard, for a very, very important piece on transitional justice and how actually fundamental rights are eroded all over the world. I mean, you've given so many examples, but one of the things that becomes really, really crucial in what you speak about is the ways in which emergency rule through decrees actually erodes fundamental rights, and how those fundamental rights actually lessens the trust in government in the time where we need to have fundamental rights ensured, especially in achieving kind of community and community responses to the pandemic as well. When you lose those fundamental rights, you lose communities from working together to actually curb the spread of the virus. And the significance of the judiciary and the civil society in actually ensuring that those fundamental rights are not actually eroded. But one of the challenges with this pandemic that is also incredibly important is that people's ability to move is restricted, and so civil society is not able to be as effective as it might have been had we had a little more mobility in this time. So it's also about access to digital processes that allows people to actually exercise their rights. And so one of the things that became quite evident in what you said was the ways in which social inequality will be entrenched, but also will, in some ways, ensure that some of these rights are not actually exercised because of lack of access to resources, and that makes it a very dire situation. But it also means, how do we get these instruments to work so that as a global community we can ensure that nation states are actually still governed by these global rules. And so this also makes it a huge challenge for us who sit here trying to understand, well, what can we do to make this more effective, to make these fundamental rights ensured the world over. But with those comments, I would like to actually open the discussion to everyone, and I'd like to invite everyone to start asking their questions. I think that the first person we have is a friend of ours, Magnus Wallan, and he would like to actually ask Howard a question. Can we give Magnus the unmute him? So just to tell people that when you ask a question, you are able to actually unmute yourself and ask your question. But for the rest of the time, if everyone can stay muted, that would be quite helpful in terms of sound. So Magnus, if you'd like to unmute yourself and ask the question, please go ahead.
Yes, can you hear me now?
Yes.
Yeah. Hi, Howard. It was a very interesting presentation, and I will keep my question short. You made some short priorities at the end of what can be done, but looking on Sweden and possibly also Sweden within the European Union, what would your assessment be on priorities? What would be the most important for us to think about in this context for what Sweden can do and push in the COVID response?
Thanks, Magnus. Good to be in touch with you again. Actually, my suggestion is that although I'm happy to deal with questions, we should really throw it open to everybody around, and if others have ideas on, for example, Magnus's question, how Sweden and the European Union should be responding to the crisis, please pile in. Nadira, I assume that it's not just a question of me answering questions, which I think would be pretty boring, really. And I actually would like to hear from colleagues in Sweden and those based in the European Union as to what your thoughts are as to how countries ought to be responding. Certainly from the outset, I would encourage Sweden and the EU as a whole, even while they are naturally gearing up to deal with the massive challenges of COVID-19 within their own countries and within the Union, that they don't let the bigger global human rights and justice agendas fall off the radar. I'm also aware that Sweden and the European Union are doing quite a lot to assist countries emerging from conflict, deal with the pandemic, and that, of course, is absolutely necessary. But my message to Sweden and the EU is, as you do so, please be aware that these are already fragile societies. Many have been through terrible conflict and war. While some may be emerging from those states, some are still in the grip of hostilities. Some are struggling to emerge from those dire conditions. And indeed, we may very well find that the pandemic may be exacerbating tensions and may be giving rise to the kinds of conditions that will make conflict and tension ripe. So that, we really need to be monitoring fragile societies very, very closely to see where potential conflict can emerge from, and then to focus our energies and efforts to ensure that that conflict is minimized or at best prevented. And I think this goes way beyond dealing with the pandemic itself. It means that one has to look into the kinds of measures that I've highlighted in the different studies that I've looked at, and to support countries in ensuring that democracy is not simply abandoned in the fight against the pandemic, and that constitutional checks and balances remain respected, and that institutions that are set up, such as the courts and various oversight bodies, that their roles become even more highlighted, and that they are supported to do their jobs. And when the different countries, some of which I've highlighted this afternoon, simply trash those checks and balances, trash the rule of law, that countries like Sweden and the EU stand up and make their voices heard and point out that, that this is not acceptable and that the pandemic is not an excuse to abandon these standards and to abandon the checks and balances that one would normally respect.
Thank you, Howard. I mean, this is really about how the global community can become accountable to each other, but also how we establish trust in this time, because I mean, we are still human beings with fears around, you know, our mortality. This is an existential crisis as well. And when fundamental rights are eroded together with existential anxieties, this makes it a very, very sensitive time for all of us. And how do we make sure, or how do we ensure that we actually still maintain rule of law and we still maintain the principles of human rights? Our next participant who has a question is Margot van der Vliet from the UN, based in Bamako in Mali. Go ahead, Margot. Unmute your mic.
Yes, I've just done that. Thank you very much, Nadira. Thank you very much, Howard. Very, very interesting theme of this webinar today. First of all, I wanted to make clear that I'm speaking as a private person, though I have been working in the MINUSMA peacekeeping and stabilization mission in Mali since 2013. Therefore, a couple of things I wanted to share from the lens of Mali on this particular theme of COVID-19 and transitional justice. And first of all, I wanted to refer to two publications from the International Center for Transitional Justice, which I found extremely interesting. There's the one from 2015 on how the Justice and Reconciliation Commission was being set up in Mali. And then there is the more recent one, obviously, on what we're talking about today, which is COVID-19 and transitional justice. And I just wanted to sort of explain to participants how COVID-19 is perceived in Mali by the population, first of all. There is a bit of denial in Mali from the population, in the sense that for them it's something that only touches Europeans and it will not get to them. And numbers are pretty low in Mali. So for them it is something like, oh, well, you know, it is something that the Europeans have brought in, it will go away with the Europeans, we're not so much concerned. We're also not in a lockdown. Churches have been closed, mosques have not. And we have seen recently mass gatherings and manifestations, and the proximity also in the mosques and in the normal day-to-day lives are impressive. And if you go around Bamako, I mean, there's not really a lot of difference if we compare to 3-4 months ago. So interesting to note that. Then in Mali, COVID-19 is an aggravating element in so many other issues that make up the crisis in Mali, which are the terrorist threat, the threat from militia groups, armed groups, poor governance, corruption. And it's actually interesting, though, that I'm saying another aggravating element, because over the last 2 weeks, we've seen massive demonstrations led by a local imam who is denouncing poor governance and who is even asking for the president of the republic to resign. So a lot of social discontent. But again, the question here, or the issue here, is also in terms of sequencing of the different problems. Lack of justice. Yes, the commission is up and running, but to what extent will it actually be able to address the concerns that the population has for decades, because it covers the period of of the 60s up till 2013, which was marked also by a number of Tuareg rebellions. Very, very complex story. I will not go further into that. But it's always a question of, well, particularly in a country, in a developing country like Mali, to what extent for the population also what the priorities are and what are the points where we can apply leverage. Because the first priority is always immediate survival, is how will I feed my family? Who will I vote for? Is that a political issue, or is that a question if some corrupt politician pays me 1,000 francs CFA, will I just vote for whoever they ask me to vote for and being able to feed my family? There's all this array of different aspects that obviously drive the country's politics, but also health issues. So again, what is important, particularly because I've also worked in Rwanda just after the genocide, where we saw that the Agacha courts were key in providing justice, because the international courts were simply taking too much time. Now, there's a lot that can be said on that as well, but just to conclude, and also towards Howard, I mean, it's interesting, it came in another question as well, finding the best leverage points also to serve a population as best as we can, whereas we're oftentimes dealing with very corrupt governments who, as you mentioned, for example, in El Salvador, just put the verdict of a constitutional, do not respect the verdict of a constitutional court. What has actually happened in Mali is that it is the constitutional court that actually came out with with a verdict on the elections, which was actually not correct at all, and not in respect of free fair elections. But I will leave it at that. I've been quite long. I do apologize. Thank you.
Thanks, Margot, for your insights and for letting us have the context of Mali. And indeed, you paint some very big challenges and very disturbing trends. And I'm sure those working in similar contexts will probably recognize the challenges that are being faced on the ground. So you raise quite a few issues, and of course, when it comes to transitional justice, you know, this discipline, as we've come to understand it, quite typically and unfortunately, there's a view that somehow, if we engage in some of the typical practices that we do in transitions, that it is going to sort out the problems, it'll deal with the past, and it'll put up those guarantees of non-recurrence we all want and create a future based on tolerance and respect for human rights. Of course, doing all that in the midst of a pandemic really does make it really very difficult. Some might even add that it's something of mission impossible at these times. And you point to the fact that the Truth Commission in Mali is still operating, but that it has a very substantial mandate running from the 1960s all the way to 2013, and that there is some worry that the Commission won't be able to address all the concerns that have arisen from the many issues over all those decades. And typically, you know, these are the kind of expectations that are never going to be met. You know, truth commissions are so often put up as some kind of panacea. And I have to say, you know, South Africa is a guilty party in this sense, because some real myth or view has taken root that it was the South African Truth Commission that somehow sorted out our problems. It was our Truth Commission that was able to manage the transition from a repressive, racist and brutal past to a democratic and constitutional future. And for the few South Africans that I see on board, I'm pretty sure that they will tell you that wasn't the case. Certainly more movies and documentaries and books have been written about the Truth Commission than any other South African mechanism. But the Truth Commission was simply one mechanism out of many others. And frankly, the other mechanisms, the negotiation process, the constitutional building process, the peace accord process, and the different institutional reform programs were probably way more important than the work of the Truth Commission. Having said that, that commission did do a good job in certain respects and in taking the country along an important journey and bringing home the horrors of the past. If there are those in Mali who are expecting the Truth Commission in Mali to play that role, then of course their hopes are going to be dashed and their expectations are not going to be met. And I think it is quite incumbent upon the Commission itself and those that work with the Commission to point out to Malians that this is not the work of that Truth Commission. That Truth Commission is simply to interrogate the past and to look at ways of ensuring that that past is not revisited upon the country. So it is an important job they have to do, but they will certainly not be able to address those issues in the short, medium, or long term. So that is something that I think stakeholders in Mali really have to take forward. You have pointed out that we do need to look at alternatives to traditional mechanisms, and I think the example of the Gacaca courts in Rwanda is a good example. I'm not going to go into the pros and cons of the Gacaca courts. They have been criticized as not always observing due process and of course, targeting people from one side and not the other. But nonetheless, I think you point out correctly that they were able to deal with tens of thousands of cases that the traditional mechanisms, both domestic court mechanisms as well as the international tribunal, could never have dealt with. And so yes, we have to be imaginative. We do have to start look at alternative processes and alternative mechanisms when it comes to dealing with really big problems facing societies such as Mali. And I'd be happy to hear other viewpoints on this as well.
Thank you, Margot, for your question and also for raising the issue around stigma and how the coronavirus is being seen in Mali as a European disease as well, and Howard also for elaborating on the shortcomings of truth and reconciliation commissions, and that South Africa's example is by no means something that we should hail as the best way forward. In fact, it has actually shown that it is an unfinished history, and you are the advocate taking some of the security branch people to court to try and get to the bottom of the many people who have been killed in South Africa in police detention during apartheid. And also, I mean, the fact that, the virus also amplifies, ongoing challenges that countries or nations face. So those are some of the things that we have to deal with in this time. And it's an ongoing issue, and it will be an ongoing issue as long as we will be dealing with viruses and social inequality and unfinished histories. Our next speaker, our next participant is, I hope I'm getting your name right, Kuku Westa. Is that correct?
That's correct, Camila. Thank you very much. Can you guys hear me?
Yes, we can.
Right. I'd like to thank Howard for a well insight presentation, and also to the lady from Mali. I think for the insight and the perspectives you gave. I was just wondering as to far, I mean, the issue of disparity that was mentioned in Howard's presentation is very relevant. And I, for example, I'm speaking from Finland under the warm sun here, and I'm originally from Liberia myself, but I've lived here over 30 years and following the development both in the global south and in Europe. And as I said in my comment, that these issues of this of violations of justices or the continuation of injustices is quite a common thing. However, it becomes more amplified in a crisis situation such as the corona or the COVID-19 epidemic circumstances. But my question, or if not a question, but a comment, is that how, what we need to understand here is also, take for example, I like to comment on the Malian situation. The perception of COVID as such has to do with the either ignorance or the lack of information about diseases. And one would think logically that a disease that originated from China or began in China, spread out in Italy at a very fast pace, and then extended into the US in New York, and then comes back to Germany. And then one from Africa or from Pakistan or India, we wonder how on earth is this possible? And given the lack of information, the lack of understanding of how viruses travel, for example. So we can always wonder the context. The European context or the African context has to do with how much information is fed into the population base. And as such, we need to then understand that if under normal circumstances, injustices prevail, both in Europe and Africa or Asia, we can imagine how much that would quadruple in terms of this impact of injustice or the lack of the production or the dealing with injustices. So to speak of transitional justice as such, all of the elements or organs of government or governance are basically shut down, and we cannot expect the same reaction that will be taken in Europe or in a European country. So for example, in Finland, we didn't have a lockdown as such. We had a semi-lockdown where everything was based on the responsibilities of citizens, how much we value our safety and the safety of others as a collective, as a collective impact. So it all has to do with the basic disparity that exists existentially. And when you come with a crisis situation, people are they're very dumbfounded to deal with or to react in a very logical situation or more rational. So it is more of a comment, but also a reflection on how do we in Europe, with the ability to kind of impact good governance in Africa or the global south, and how do we commit ourselves to these agendas? And because we don't commit completely, we have these backlash of events, as we see in Mali, for example. And I know the situation in Liberia, it might be worse than in Mali, but of course, there's still an impact of the virus and how it's dealt with. Because when you lock down a situation where people have to go out to deal with subsistence issues, I mean, what you do, you kind of recreate a secondary problem. Hunger could be an issue. Hygiene could be an issue. And this could also cause other functional problems that was never anticipated in the very beginning. I hope I made myself clear, but I like to rest on this at this point. And thank you for listening.
Thank you, Kuku, for raising those issues. And I'm pleased to hear you from Liberia. It's a country close to my heart. I've spent a lot of time there, particularly when the Truth Commission was being set up, and trying to follow developments remotely. So yeah, I think you raise some important issues, particularly when it comes to questions of perception and information, or rather the lack of information. And I think questions around public education and outreach and communication becomes even more important in these times. Information should be comprehensive, but more importantly, accessible. And ways and means, need to be found to ensure that the right information does get to the people who need them. Public education, outreach, and communication is not my field of expertise. So I certainly invite others who might be more familiar to make a comment. But why outreach and education is particularly important is because of the potential for great stigma and persecution that can arise. So we heard from Margot about the stigma of those who have the virus in Mali, and I also gave the example of South Sudan. We've seen discrimination and action taken against Muslims in India, Bangladesh, Sri Lanka, because they are accused falsely of spreading the virus. And these things are incredibly dangerous. It's not just a question of hate speech. It's a lot more than that, because this could spiral out of control. This could turn into real tension, conflict, violence, and potentially worse. So, to my mind, the best way to deal with these things is education and is communication and outreach. In relation to Europe, and what Europe can do in relation to good governance, there I rely on my European friends to respond. I should just add that I don't believe Europe necessarily has a monopoly over good governance. I've pointed to some EU members that, in fact, have a very poor record of good governance, not to mention Hungary, which in fact is pretty much a dictatorial state. I gave the example of Bulgaria, and even a Nordic country like Norway, in the beginning at least, rode roughshod over Parliament and introduced measures that effectively bypassed Parliament. It was only civil society that actually forced the government to go through Parliament and to do so in a more comprehensive and participatory manner.
Thank you. Thank you, Kuku, for your question, and also for, again, raising the importance of information and also the importance of trust to allow people to make choices around social distancing. But of course, we know that in many cases, especially in South Africa, where there's overcrowding in impoverished areas, social distancing is not a luxury many can be afforded to. So this is very much a privileged position, and trust from governments, especially in the Nordic region, around their citizenry, around social distancing, is based on the kinds of trusts that have been established. But again, this is a privileged position. Our next participant who has a question is Mahmoud Kamara. Hi, Mahmoud, can you unmute?
Hi, yes, I can hear you. Hi, Nadira, thank you very much. And my name is Mahmoud Kamara, and I'm calling from Accra, but I'm originally from Sierra Leone, and I'm currently the director of the newly established Africa Transitional Justice Legacy Fund. We're based in Ghana, but we cover 7 countries in West Africa. Thank you so much for having this discussion, because for us, it is very crucial as grant makers to understand what the trends are and what opportunities there will be for us to support civil society organizations that are intervening on transitional justice issues in the continent. I have a few remarks that I'd like to make, and then to my question. The few key points that I will probably want to highlight are from West Africa. And I'd like to make mention of a few developing that have emerged as a result of COVID, how those have affected transitional justice interventions in the continent, but also specifically in West Africa. The first one is Gambia. We all see that Gambia is one of the newest countries embarking on transitional justice processes in the region. We have been informed of a pause to the process in the Gambia as a result of COVID. The TRRC hearings that were going on had to be put on hold, even though options were provided for people to submit their testimonies via forming. People just did not take up that opportunity because these are not traditional or kind of conventional methods of them giving information, but of course of the risks that are associated as well with those. So it goes in line with what Howard mentioned earlier about how you combine the opportunities that technology provides with the risk that it also poses in terms of rights. The other example that I'd like to give is Nigeria, and this is not necessarily a good example in the sense that when COVID started, when the pandemic started, the issue of the militarization of policing functions that Howard has also mentioned earlier was very huge. We had allegations or accusations from the National Human Rights Commission claiming that about 18 people, at least 18 people were killed by police, the Nigerian police force. And this number was higher than the number of COVID-related deaths in the first week of the pandemic in that country. And we know that there's an ongoing conflict in the northeast of Nigeria. And this all have led to the issue that we're all talking about, which is the perception, the denial, and the refusal of compliance because of the increasing militarization of the government's response. We now coming to the question of opportunities and laws, because I don't want to take much of the time by giving lots of examples from West Africa, but there are loads of other countries that are doing good in some ways in terms of digitization of the government's response, but also in other ways in terms of collaboration between civil society, especially the use of local structures, local community structures that have been used in the past to mobilize, to negotiate and provide alternative dispute resolutions. How states are using these community structures to ensure that one, they help in the prevention of the disease, but also the prevention of conflict-related conflicts and violence. My question to Howard and Nadira, therefore, what are the opportunities that are there for civil society organizations that are working on transitional justice to continue working on TJ, but also take advantage of things that will be emerging as a result of COVID in their response post-COVID, in post-COVID West Africa? What opportunities should we be looking at? And what opportunities for us as grant makers we should be looking to supporting going forward? Thank you.
Thanks, Mahmoud. It was really good to hear of the developments in West Africa. Very pleased to hear that you hail from Sierra Leone. I spent a year and a bit in your country back in 2003 when I was with the Truth Commission. Yes, as you point out, there's a lot to look at, both on the positive and the downside. And so thanks for the examples you've given in relation to the Gambia and Nigeria. Yeah, it certainly is sad to see the Truth, Reconciliation and Reparations Commission in the Gambia being placed on hold, of course, quite understandably. But, that commission really, I think, holds a lot of promise. I think the hearings that they have been holding have been quite incredible, with a major chunk of the country listening in and learning about the past and learning about facts that they simply weren't aware of. So I think the Commission was really on a roll. And so to be stopped in the midst of that is really quite devastating. And, I'm not that surprised to hear that they haven't really been able to encourage the provision of testimony by telephone and or internet. Of course, one must really try. One has to use alternative means, and they should keep on trying. But if you perhaps put yourself in the shoes of a victim or of a witness who wants to share his or her story, your first prize is to speak to somebody. The first prize is to speak to the Commission in a manner where they get to listen to you, and of course to be able to share that story with your community and the wider nation, which we've seen in places, commissions like South Africa, Peru, Kenya, and many others. And it's that experience that makes those commissions so powerful. And I would imagine that many of those victims are probably saying to themselves, we would rather wait until we can appear in person. And actually, as a lawyer in South Africa representing victims of apartheid era atrocities, where we are running trials or these judicial inquiries, we also looked at the possibility of moving our proceedings online. And aside from the technical challenges, we just took the view that it simply wouldn't be the same thing. It wouldn't be replicating that experience, and it ultimately wouldn't be in the interests of justice to have important proceedings left to the whims of unreliable technology. Yes, when it comes to civil society and what civil society can do, particularly those that were previously focusing on transitional justice, it is quite a big challenge, because ideally you don't want to abandon the work you were doing previously. And as I mentioned in my presentation, I think the number one priority has to be focused on the question of non-recurrence and prevention. And so this really means working with other organizations, and I was very pleased to hear about what's happening in places like Liberia and elsewhere in West Africa with alternative dispute resolution and local communities collaborating with authorities. And that's really, I think, the answer. But, close monitoring, really understanding what is going on in the communities and throughout the country, identifying where the problems are going to emerge, where are those fault lines, what are the sparks that could give rise to potential conflict or violence, and then lastly, of course, what can be done about it, what measures can be taken, what institutions can be strengthened, what can organizations like your own do to ensure that if there are going to be tensions, and we can't prevent all the tensions, what can be done to keep them at a minimum?
Mohamed, thank you for your input. And in terms of asking the question, what kinds of opportunities as a funder, as a donor, do you think is important to, one of the things that comes up is community solidarity and community responses to COVID and the ways in which communities respond. Those processes outside of transitional justice is also about access to services, and that's also really important. So I think that in strengthening civil society organizations right now and strengthening community responses to the pandemic is equally as important. But our next participant with a question is Yuval Balisha. Did I pronounce that correctly?
Hi, yes, well done. It's common, thing that we often have conversation for a few minutes about how to pronounce my name. Firstly, I would like to say thank you for this platform, and especially to Howard Varney. I mean, you've been an inspiration. I've watched a bit of your documentaries on your case in Ahmed Timol, and I think it was really inspiring to see that there's still a lot of people fighting for the justices in South Africa. My name's Yuval. I'm a medical intern in a township outside of Gauteng. And I really just want to kind of really speak to about some of the pertinent issues that you guys have been mentioning with regards to the stigma that has been involved with COVID. And luckily enough, I've just actually fallen ill with COVID, and so I've been self-quarantining with myself for a few days. And really, it's a lot of the stigma that has been associated with what my roommates have been receiving from really telling other people that they're rooming with someone with COVID. And it was interestingly because, it's something that you wouldn't expect, because most of the symptoms that I've experienced was that of a common cold, perhaps with more of a moderate than a mild form. And the interesting thing about this COVID thing is that, looking at the nature of it, and I do stand to be corrected as I am a junior practitioner, is that, most of the cases will be mild and we won't know of them. And it's really due to the magnitude of how contagious this disease and how it manifests in such a large magnitude that it really kind of allows us to see the overwhelming burden on the hospitals and the increased number of needs of the ICU. And that's what makes this quite problematic. So the things that we see on the news feed is that of intensive care units, etc. And it kind of removes us from the reality of this, is that, for myself, I've lived through a reality that a lot of people have, is that this will be a mild process. You would feel like you're going through a mild cold. And interestingly enough, and the way people interact with other people that have been diagnosed, and a lot of communities in the township, like a lot of individuals in the township, a lot of the families are asked by the community because they have a member who tested positive. And again, as this conversation has mentioned, it's due to the lack of understanding what this virus is and how it manifests in human beings. And it goes on to say that perhaps having conversations like this, and really, this won't be an alien experience for many of us. And we've seen that, the Italian population, the Chinese population, the American population, they've all experienced it in large numbers. So we all will experience it. So a lot of, for instance, my roommate's friends who have experienced this disease kind of laid off onto something that is probably most not COVID, and it in fact is. But what's interesting about it, and so this kind of gives rooms to discrimination. But interestingly enough, what I was most shocked as being a healthcare worker in this process was, the initial lockdown, the level 5 that South Africa experienced, was kind of really went against our constitution. And I was shocked in the sense of testing. Initially, you weren't allowed to not refuse testing, and I'm sure this regulation has been lifted a bit and made less hard. But and that was the most interesting thing for me as a healthcare worker, really, to see that this you didn't have a choice. And that goes against our constitution, thinking that we preach as South Africans to have the freedom to choose whether you want to test for HIV or not. It's at your liberty. You're protected by the constitution. But as soon as the COVID came in, I think it's our relationship with this virus and how we understand it, and really how we move the message around. And I think it will really come to conversing with each other from our own experiences of going through the virus, which most of us in reality will go through a mild form. And unfortunately, due to the magnitude, there will be a large number of individuals that are suffering dire consequences of it. But yeah, and I think it's really through conversation that we'll be able to really dampen the problems that we're having with the stigma. Thank you.
Thanks, Yova, for your experiences and for your courage in coming out. That, in your words, luckily enough, you have COVID, or rather, you have the virus. I'm very pleased to hear that it's not of a serious nature. And indeed, I suppose most people in the world, unless a vaccine is generated soon enough, will contract the virus, and hopefully for the vast majority, it will not be of a particularly serious nature. But there's no doubt that the virus has changed all our lives without exception, and that we are not going back to where we were. There's no normal to go back to. Whatever normal we get to will be a new normal. And you pointed out that, South Africans, we all love our constitution. We love our rights. And we know how to demand our rights, which I think is a pretty amazing thing. But I think it's been an important journey the last few weeks and months, that even though we have an enforceable constitution, we have a Bill of Rights that can be invoked. Rights themselves are never entirely and absolutely watertight, and they're not completely absolute. And in times like these, governments will have some latitude to take action that, on the face of it, do infringe those rights. And in many cases, the infringements will be justifiable and will be necessary. And in perhaps some other cases, they may overstep the mark. And luckily, we have an independent judiciary, which is strong enough and courageous enough to step in from time to time and to point out to the government that they have infringed rights, and in some cases, those infringements are not justifiable. And we have indeed seen one or two cases just in the last few weeks. Needless to say, they're all probably going on appeal, so we'll find out. I see my colleague Gina Malindi is online, and he may very well be involved in them. And if he has anything to add, please do. But yes, we have to make sacrifices, and this is a time of compromise. And frankly, we simply don't know enough. We have to accept that, just like we're often in the dark, and you've said that you yourself, as a medical practitioner, you're still feeling your way around, and we have to accept that our governments are in the same position. And it'll take some time for them to learn about the mistakes and to pick up on those lessons. And to some degree, we need to be patient. Of course, where they do step out of line and engage in actions like security forces have engaged in South Africa, then we need to rush to the courts. And in the one case, the Collins Khoza case, that's what activists and lawyers did. They rushed to the courts, and they did get an order restraining the police and the army from those excesses, as well as an order requiring them to set out the guidelines to guide their conduct. But until we get all the facts, and it'll take some time to do that, we have to accept that we're all in the dark together, and we all have to work out ways of going forward. But with every day that goes by, we're gathering more facts and more evidence, and hopefully we are getting smarter. But I think on the whole, countries that have constitutions that uphold rights, and countries that have activist lawyers and judges willing to stand up to authority, those are the countries where hopefully the excesses will be less brazen than in others.
Thank you for your question, Yuval. Are there any more questions? Because I think that we might not have more questions. Before I respond to you, Yuval, I also would like to invite Advocate Tina Malindi to also respond to the question around South Africa's constitution. because he is an advocate on human rights as well. So perhaps we can get a little more clarity from Advocate Malindi on this. But Yuval, one of the lessons that we did learn in South Africa around the HIV and AIDS pandemic was that constitutional rights are absolutely crucial in terms of preventing stigma as well. And also mandatory testing was never done in South Africa, specifically around constitutional rights. And these are fundamental rights that should not be eroded at all. But also the issue around the lockdown and the ways in which Howard spoke about when we do have these lockdowns, they have to ensure that fundamental rights are protected. Advocate Malindi, would you like to respond to the question around our constitution?
Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon, Nadira and Howard. I hope everyone can hear me. Thank you for inviting me to add a word or two. I was going to respond to Yuval, but Howard has done a sterling job in his response about balancing the powers of the authorities to act in the circumstances currently, depending on the risks that are involved. That the authorities sometimes will have to restrict rights more than they are afforded in our constitution, and it will always be dictated by the levels of risks. So comparison to HIV infections and coronavirus, we see very different risks that present themselves. So whereas in HIV situations, one may refuse justifiably to be tested, it seems like the state's intrusion into that right in the instances of coronavirus will be more relaxed than in HIV situations because of the manner of infection, the risk posed to other individuals as opposed to the HIV situation. And Howard has dealt with that, that in our constitution, every infringement of a right has to be justified. And I think it's section 36 or thereabouts of the constitution. So we have that advantage, and we have the advantage that the courts were not completely shut, and that urgent matters could still go to court with the directions of the courts, the heads of courts, to ensure that people are not exposed during those appearances. The other issue that in South Africa is maybe different from other places, and Howard, again, I'm repeating what you've already said, because we have a vibrant civil society. Almost all incidents of violations of rights during the lockdown, certainly levels 5 and 4, did not escape public scrutiny. Even if the authorities did not deal with those issues, there were enough uproars for the authorities to know that they don't have a free hand during this period. And the last comment I would like to make, Nadira, is that this is a fantastic platform to deal with transitional justice and to also check on the authorities. I think the appetite to use the same powers that they've enjoyed under the Disaster Management Act and the regulations there in post-COVID. And we need to be vigilant as Howard said earlier, that they do not assume that the powers they enjoy now will be the same powers post-COVID. What I would recommend also is that post-COVID justice must also encompass and embrace the fact that the inequalities that have been exacerbated during this period do not persist post-COVID. And while we are concerned about transitional justice, as in constitutionalism, the rule of law, etc., the shape of the economy and economies of the world and the countries post-COVID, we need to be as vigilant in that regard. And it will be interesting to know whether there are civil society organizations that are concentrating on how the economy should be shaped post-COVID. Because what I see, the discussions currently are led and monopolized by capital, which will want to use post-COVID economies to further dictate and restrict the rights of ordinary people in terms of socioeconomic rights beyond COVID-19. Thank you.
Thank you, Advocate Malindi, for that input. I think you raised a very important issue, and that is around economic justice. And one of the questions that Mahmed Kamara asked is what should donors focus on? And I think that you've actually responded to Mahmed's question, civil society organizations and the responsibility around economic justice post-COVID, because as Howard pointed out, social inequalities are exacerbated and amplified during this pandemic, but it also is a question around transitional justice. And post-COVID, if we fail to address these questions, we will be perpetuating these injustices and doing a lot of harm to many people as a result. So with that being said, I think we're coming to the end of our webinar today. Well, some of the issues that have been raised today are around issues around trust and trust in government and trust in civil society and in citizens to also play their part in being responsible around corona. This is not the AIDS pandemic. This is a very rapidly spreading pandemic. None of us are immune to this. We have not found a vaccine for this at the moment. And as we can say, in terms of Sweden as well, herd immunity is very slow to come by. And so we're going to be dealing with this virus for a very long time until we're able to actually manage to find a vaccine that we can roll out globally. But these are the issues that also affect the ways in which transitional justice will be meted out. And of course, truth and reconciliation commissions are by no means, a remedy. They are just one of the ways in which to deal with transitional justice, but we have to follow through with actually gaining justice. I'm reading a book at the moment about how compromise is not necessarily a good thing, but because in terms of justice, we really do have to find other ways of finding ways forward that's not based on compromise, but really respect the idea that we all have to be heard and seen, and that's where economic justice also becomes very, very crucial. So before we close, I would like to invite my colleague, Henning Melber, from the Nordic Africa Institute. Henning is also a card-carrying member of SWAPO, the Southwest African People's Organization. So Henning, if you'd like to also highlight some of the issues that came out for you and some of the issues as a SWAPO member that were pertinent for you.
Thank you very much, Nadira, and thank you very much, Howard, and everyone else having been interested and contributing to this exchange. I think we face special challenges, and Howard has alluded to them. The term transitional justice implies that it's justice in transition. So it's an ever ongoing process because societies are always in transition. And the subject might change, but transitional justice has to be in each and every society on the agenda by the people, for the people. The problem we are confronted with now is COVID-19 as a global pandemic, because it hugely complicates matters for reasons already to some extent summarized. It's a situation of crisis, and crises tend to bring out the best in people and the worst in people. So it brings out solidarity, it brings out neighborhood help, it brings out assistance to the marginalized and the poor, but it also brings out repressive tendencies, brutality, social Darwinism of unknown dimensions. And it was already referred to that COVID-19 provokes security matters, states of emergency, where those who have a tendency of authoritarian rule feel encouraged to promote their own repressive style. And even in democratic societies, we can witness that policymakers are not protected from these tendencies. And it was very painful to witness in Southern Africa, especially in South Africa, but also in Namibia, which is my home, that the security syndrome, which was provoked by the lockdown, led to practices by police and military, which revoked memories of apartheid days, as if we haven't had since 30 or 25 years democracy, civil and human rights. And the states seem to be rather reluctant in this situation to give ultimate preference to the protection of the poor, of the weak, of the marginalized, but it brings back a very hurtful reminder that those are among, like Brazil, the most unequal societies in the world. And the highest price in survival strategies is again paid by the poorest and the weakest. And some of them said, it doesn't help us to lock down, to protect us from a virus if we then have to die of hunger. These are the difficult choices of governments. And these are choices which unfortunately very often tend to be going into a more authoritarian direction than into a more liberal variation. And at the end of the day, it will be those weakest who pay the highest price, and social inequalities and social injustice, unfortunately so, will be deeper in the new normality, whatever normality it might be, than it has been in what we experienced prior to COVID-19. And there is another dimension to that, which I follow with a lot of mixed feelings and pain, and Howard has also referred to that in passing, that those issues of transitional justice, of social justice, which actually we want the governments to deal with, are shelved under the so-called exceptional circumstances. Howard knows, maybe not everyone else, there are the relatives of Albert Luthuli, Steve Biko, Ahmed Timol, and Neil Eggett, and they speak on behalf of many more who accuse, rightly so, the South African government that they are not recognizing what they paid lip service to in bringing back social justice to those descendants of victims who were harmed, who were murdered, who were tortured under apartheid. Sometimes with a ridiculous argument as like now that those culprits have reached an age where they would not be able to stand in court. Now with my German-born background, I know there is a different way to deal with this. While we are speaking, there is a man in court facing accusations of crimes he committed when he was 17 years old in concentration camps against hundreds and thousands of Jews who were killed. That doesn't mean you send him to jail, but it means you hold that person accountable. And to be held accountable, you need to be, no matter what age you are. In many of the societies, we have political office bearers. They are in their 70s, in their 80s, or think of Robert Mugabe in his early 90s. No one would dare to say we can't hold them accountable. So we are confronted with double binds, with ambiguities, with messages which are twisted. And I think that's a special challenge. And I'm grateful that at the end of the debate, a reference was made to the need of a rule of law, to independent judiciaries, to a constitutional framework which is value-based, which maintains and protects civil rights. And in a country like South Africa, a vibrant civil society sector and social activists who advocate those rights. The problem is, in such societies with such gross inequalities, people need a certain minimum level of material empowerment to A, know their rights, and B, to claim their rights. And that's another challenge. And I think this is a challenge we are facing and should be very much aware of in the stages of preparing for a post-COVID-19 scenario, when we are back into the issues we are facing. And then we face double challenges: to return to the issues which are unfinished business when COVID-19 kicked in, and add to them the challenges provoked by the unexpected circumstances which created dubious practices by governments, by security, by police, when it comes to the infringement of civil rights. So there's a huge agenda on our plate. Maybe if I can add with one Namibian dimension at the end, which goes back in history, because it also needs to be aware. I made reference to the Nazi heinous crimes. It goes further back. If social justice is serious, we need to go back. And in Namibia, there are at the moment bilateral negotiations between Germany and Namibia to find an adequate, or at least partially adequate way to deal with the genocide committed 115 years ago against the Ovaherero and the Nama. And that underlines what William Faulkner said. I quote him: "The past is not dead. It is not even past." So let's not pretend there are chapters which are closed. We can work with them. We need to deal with them to reduce the pain and find a way, especially for those descendants of victims, to come to terms with what their parents, grandparents experienced. And it doesn't matter if that happened 30 years ago or if it happened 110 years ago. There is one current initiative in the Namibian parliament, and Namibia never had a Truth and Reconciliation Commission like South Africa. For them, the government reconciliation was defined as close the chapters, don't speak about the past, which implied we're not speaking about the human rights violations by apartheid, but also don't speak about the human rights violations we committed in exile, where thousands of our own people ended in dungeons and only a few hundred returned to Namibia. They are stigmatized until the very day. But that does not mean when you sweep it under the carpet that it goes away. In Namibia, we celebrate on 3 holidays Kasinga Day, commemorating the victims of an attack by the South Africans in the late 1970s on a refugee camp in Kasinga. We celebrate the Heroes Day, which was the day when the armed struggle in the patriotic history was terminated to have started. And we celebrate the Women's Day, which is actually the Human Rights Day, in commemoration of a massacre committed a year before Sharpeville in resistance against forced removal in Windhoek. But that is selective history, because all 3 holidays commemorate the heroic narrative, but they ignore the victims of the struggle on the other side. And social justice cannot be one-sided. So there is now a motion submitted to the Namibian Parliament, and I only want to read out of the 6 pages one little paragraph before I stop. And that motion was submitted by a 1-member parliamentarian party, which was the first liberation movement, SWANU, which never became a dominant political force. And it reads as follows, I quote, "The question of reconciliation is inextricably linked to the most pressing and growing challenges facing Namibia today, and include gender-based violence, endemic violence, racism, inequality, intolerance, tribalism, and so on. I therefore call on the government to establish a permanent peace, justice, and reconciliation foundation in order to craft a blueprint for lasting peace and a durable foundation for social harmony and nation building." Now, if one is cynical, one might say that is wishful thinking. And certainly there will be limits to implement it. But if we are not trying to institutionalize forms of engaging with social injustices in the past and in the present, we will never be able to reduce them. We will never be able to return at least some dignity, some recognition to victims. And I think that is the ultimate goal of social transitional justice. And I'm very grateful to Howard, to Advocate Malindi, to many more, to many of those independent judges in the South African Constitutional Court, to those judges in Namibia and elsewhere, who are willing to speak truth to power, who are loyal to a value-based framework, and are also willing to speak right, even if governments find it difficult to accept it. So I'm very grateful, Howard and Advocate Malindi, for your commitments and the commitments of so many others. And it's a reminder also for us elsewhere that social injustices exist in any society. There are some societies where they are much bigger than in others, but there is not a single society I'm aware of where there would be no social injustices, which means also we all should see it as a challenge and a commitment to promote transitional justice and social justice wherever we live, and in solidarity with all the other people living elsewhere. I thank you again very much.
Thank you, Henning, for those words of wisdom, but also about the dignity that should be afforded to the victims of injustices. And especially with the corona pandemic, I think that becomes amplified, that we need to deal with this in a dignified manner to ensure that people's rights are not eroded. I would like to thank Howard Varney for actually doing this webinar, for taking me on with all my irritations of persisting in the quest for having this webinar. I think it was really important. I've been wanting to do this webinar for a very long time. In fact, we were planning to do this as a workshop, a 2-day workshop in Uppsala. And since that wasn't able to happen, it became a much more public event. And for that, I'm really grateful that you were able to do this with us today. I'm also very grateful for my friend, Advocate Malindi, for actually being here today and also adding to the conversation, and to all the participants who had questions and who stayed throughout this conversation. I'd like to thank our director, Therese, for being here in what is a wonderful Swedish summer day, and for all my colleagues who have also been part of the webinar, who have not actually left and gone and sat in the sun. I would like to thank you all for being here today, and I wish you all much love and health, and I hope that we all can stay strong and healthy through this pandemic. From us at the Nordic Africa Institute, from Camilla and myself, we thank you for being part of this webinar.